On my 35th birthday, the only notification on my phone was a withdrawal alert from my bank. $5,000 for first-class tickets to Europe. $12,000 for a suite at the Ritz Paris. I sat alone in my dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of the Chicago skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened Instagram, and there it was. A photo of my younger sister Jasmine raising a glass of vintage champagne in a first-class cabin. The caption read, "Finally living the luxury life we deserve, thanks to the best parents ever." Beneath it, my mother had commented that Jasmine was the only daughter who ever made the family proud. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply took a slow sip of my red wine and set the glass down on my marble coffee table. I opened my laptop and logged into the family trust account. I watched the numbers on the screen. I saw another transaction pending for a designer handbag. I moved my cursor to the red button that said freeze all assets and report fraud. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a single second. I thought about the years of neglect. I thought about the missed birthdays. Then I clicked. Across the ocean, I knew their world had just stopped turning. Before I tell you how my brother-in-law ended up in handcuffs, and my mother ended up on her knees begging for forgiveness, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the invisible child who funded everyone else's dreams. My name is Nia, and I live in a world of numbers. Numbers do not lie. Only people do. My family thinks I am a simple bookkeeper. They think I file tax returns for a living and live in a small apartment because I cannot afford better. They believe I am dull and stingy and unlovable. They have no idea who I really am. They do not know I own the penthouse I am sitting in. They do not know I drive a paid-off luxury sedan kept in a private garage 3 blocks away. I am a forensic accountant. When a cartel hides money in offshore shells, the government calls me. When a billionaire divorces his wife and tries to hide his private jets, his wife's lawyers call me. I can find a single missing cent in a ledger of billions. I have destroyed empires with a spreadsheet. I hunt down hidden assets for the FBI, and I trace laundered money for the most powerful firms in the city. I am not someone you want to have as an enemy. Yet for 20 years I let my own mother Louise and my father Joe treat me like an automated teller machine while they worshiped the ground my sister walked on. They mistook my silence for stupidity. They mistook my generosity for weakness. They thought the money would flow forever because they believed they were entitled to my labor. Tonight the silence ends. Tonight I am not just the daughter who pays the bills, I am the auditor. And I just found a discrepancy that is going to cost them everything they have. The audit begins now. 4 hours before I froze their assets, I was sitting at table 42 in the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Chicago. The reservation had been made months in advance. It was my 35th birthday, and for the first time in years, my parents had promised to celebrate with me. Not Jasmine, just mom, dad, and me. A chance to be seen. A chance to be a daughter instead of a bank account. I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing a silk dress I had bought specifically for this night. By 7:30, I had checked my phone 12 times. By 8 o'clock, the maitre d' was casting apologetic glances in my direction. The restaurant was a symphony of clinking crystal and hushed laughter, but around me there was only a bubble of humiliating silence. The 3 empty velvet chairs across from me felt less like furniture and more like accusations. They screamed that I was not worth showing up for. At 8:15, the waiter approached. He was young and kind, which made the situation infinitely worse. He asked if I wanted to order an appetizer while I waited. I smiled a smile that felt like it might crack my face and told him they were just running a little late. Traffic in the loop was terrible, I said. I was lying to a stranger to protect the reputation of people who were not even there. I ordered a bottle of wine just to have something to do with my hands. At 8:40, I finally called my mother. The phone rang 5 times. Finally, she picked up. Her voice was breathless and chaotic. "Nia, honey, I am so sorry," she shouted over a cacophony of background noise. "The car broke down on the expressway. Dad is trying to fix it, but it is a total disaster. We are waiting for a tow truck. We are not going to make it." I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. I was about to say it was okay. I was about to offer to send a luxury Uber to pick them up. I was about to ask if they were safe. Then I heard it. Clear as a bell in the background came a tannoy announcement. Passengers for Air France Flight 402 to Paris, please proceed to Gate K12 for immediate boarding. The blood drained from my face. They were not on the side of a highway. They were at O'Hare International Airport. They were not stuck. They were leaving. The car trouble was a lie. The tow truck was a lie. My birthday dinner was not just forgotten, it was discarded. They had chosen a vacation with my sister over a milestone with me. "Oh," I said quietly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Good luck with the car, Mom." I hung up before she could invent another falsehood. I sat there for another 10 minutes, staring at the unlit candle on the table. The waiter returned. He didn't ask this time. He knew. He simply reached out and began to remove the 3 other place settings. The sound of the silverware hitting his tray was deafening. Clink. 1 place setting gone. Clink. 2 gone. Clink. 3 gone. With every item he removed, he stripped away another layer of my dignity. The table looked enormous with just me at it. People were staring. I could feel their pity on my skin like a rash. The woman at the next table whispered something to her husband and looked at me with sad eyes. I wanted to scream that I paid for this dinner. I wanted to scream that I paid for the clothes on their backs and the roof over their heads. Instead, I signaled for the check. I paid for a meal I did not eat. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cold night air. That was the moment Nia, the daughter, died, and Naya, the forensic accountant, was born. I returned to my silent apartment and kicked off my heels. The marble floor was cold beneath my feet, matching the chill spreading through my chest. I poured a glass of red wine, my hands trembling slightly not from cold, but from a rising, suffocating sense of injustice. I sat on the beige sofa and unlocked my phone. The screen's blue light cut through the darkness, illuminating the tears I refused to let fall. I opened Instagram, my thumb hovering over the app, dreading what I knew I would find. The algorithm did not make me wait. The very first post on my feed was from my mother. It was a boomerang video. My sister Jasmine and her husband Hunter were clinking crystal champagne flutes. They were nestled in the wide leather seats of a first-class cabin. Jasmine was wearing a new Gucci scarf, her head thrown back in a laugh that looked practiced and perfectly filtered. Hunter was smirking at the camera, holding up his glass in a mock toast. The location tag read, Air France First Class Lounge. But it was the caption that made my breath catch in my throat. "So happy to surprise our darling Jasmine and Hunter with a well-deserved getaway to Paris," my mother had written, followed by a string of heart emojis. "You are the only one who makes this family proud. Enjoy the city of love, my angel." I stared at the words until they blurred. The only one who makes this family proud. The sentence played on a loop in my mind, each repetition a fresh cut. I swiped left. The next photo was a screenshot of their itinerary. The Ritz Paris, a private boat tour on the Seine, a reservation at Jules Verne. I did the mental math instantly. The flights were $5,000 apiece. The hotel was $12,000 for the week. The spending money was another few thousand. The total came to roughly $25,000. My blood ran cold. The number was specific. It was too specific to be a coincidence. Exactly 3 days ago, my father had called me in a panic. He told me the roof of their house was leaking, that black mold was spreading in the attic, and that the contractor needed $25,000 immediately, or the house would be condemned. I remembered the desperation in his voice. I remembered rushing to the bank during my lunch break to wire the money because I was terrified for their safety. I had wired exactly $25,000 to the family trust account. There was no leaking roof. There was no black mold. There was no emergency. I looked back at the photo of Jasmine sipping champagne. They were drinking my hard-earned money. They had looked me in the eye, lied about their safety, and exploited my fear to fund a luxury vacation for the sister who treated me like dirt. They did not just forget my birthday. They had actively robbed me to celebrate it without me. The sadness that had weighed me down all evening evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt dangerous. This was not a family dynamic. This was a financial crime. And I was the only witness. I took a sip of wine, swallowed the bitterness, and prepared to burn it all down. You might be wondering how a forensic accountant who hunts down international fraud for a living allowed her own family to rob her blind. It is a fair question. You see, the account they were draining was titled The Jones Family Trust. It sounds noble, doesn't it? It sounds communal. But names are just marketing. In the fine print of the banking agreement, there is only one primary account holder. Me. My social security number is the one on the tax forms. My credit score is the one bearing the load. My liability is the only thing that matters to the bank. My parents and Jasmine are what the financial institutions call authorized users. It is a fancy term for children with allowances. They have shiny plastic cards with their names embossed on the front, but they do not own the vault. They just have the keys to the front door. They never bothered to read the terms and conditions because arrogance does not require literacy. They assumed that because they spent the money, it belonged to them. Tonight, I am teaching them the difference between access and ownership. Tonight, I am changing the locks. I walked over to my desk. The glass surface was cold against my wrists. I cracked my knuckles and opened the main banking portal. My laptop keyboard is mechanical. In the silence of the penthouse, each keystroke sounded like a gunshot. Click, clack, enter. I navigated to the transfer page. I did not just want to freeze the cards. That would be too gentle. That would imply that this was a temporary misunderstanding. Number 1. I needed to scorch the earth. I selected the entire balance. $185,000. This was money I had saved for their retirement. Money I had set aside for their health care. I typed the destination account number. I was not sending it back to my checking account where they could guilt me into returning it. I was sending it to a high-yield savings account under a Shell LLC. I registered 3 years ago called Phoenix Holdings. It is untouchable. It is invisible to them. It is a fortress. I watched the progress bar load. 20%, 50%, 99%. Complete. The balance on the family screen blinked once and settled on 0.00. It was the most beautiful number I had ever seen. They were currently sleeping in a $12,000 hotel room in Paris, thinking they were wealthy. They were ordering room service and planning their river cruise. They had no idea that, digitally speaking, they were already destitute. I closed the laptop with a snap. The gun had been fired. Now I just had to wait for the bullet to hit. With the trust fund emptied and the capital safely secured in my offshore fortress, I turned my attention to the plastic in their wallets. The wire transfer was the long game, but cutting off the credit lines was the immediate tactical strike that would bring them to their knees. I stood up from my desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling grid of Chicago lights. From this height, the cars looked like toys, and the people were invisible. I felt like a titan arranging pieces on a board. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the bank is Elite Fraud Protection Service. I cleared my throat and closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I was no longer Nia, the cold auditor. I was Naya, the panicked victim. The operator answered on the first ring. Agent Michael speaking. How may I assist you today, Ms. Jones? I injected a tremor into my voice, a wobble of pure anxiety that I had perfected over years of walking on eggshells around my mother. Oh, thank God you answered, Michael. I think I am in trouble. I think my identity has been compromised. I could hear the shift in his tone immediately. He went from professional to protective. Please stay calm, Ms. Jones. Tell me what is happening. I am looking at my alerts. Michael and I am seeing thousands of dollars being charged in Paris right now. My voice rose an octave, bordering on hysteria. I am not in Paris. I am right here in my apartment in Chicago. I think someone has cloned my cards. They are staying at the Ritz. They are buying designer bags. Please, you have to stop them. They are draining everything. I listened as his fingers flew across his keyboard on the other end of the line. I took a calm sip of my wine, my face completely expressionless, while my voice continued to tremble for his benefit. I see the transactions, Ms. Jones. We are flagging them as fraudulent immediately. I am issuing a code red lock on all accounts associated with your social security number. That includes the supplementary cards held by a Louise and Jasmine Jones. Do you recognize those names? I paused for a beat. The dramatic timing was crucial. They are my family members, but they are here in the States with me. If those cards are being used in France, then someone must have stolen their information too. Please, Michael, lock it all. Do not let another cent go through. Consider it done. The cards are dead as of this second. We will also notify French authorities of the potential identity theft at the hotel. You are safe now, Ms. Jones. I hung up the phone and the mask fell away instantly. A dark smile spread across my lips. I had just weaponized the very protection they relied on. In a matter of seconds, I had transformed their status symbols into worthless scrap plastic. I imagined the scene that was about to unfold across the Atlantic. They wanted the full Parisian experience. I just ensured they would get the authentic starving artist reality instead. The next time a waiter brought a card reader to their table, it would not beep with approval, it would scream decline. And when they called the bank to complain, they would not be treated as valued customers. They would be flagged as potential identity thieves using stolen cards. I raised my glass to the reflection in the window. Checkmate. While I sat in the dim light of my penthouse watching the snow begin to fall over Chicago 4,000 miles away, the sun was shining on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. I did not need a satellite feed to know exactly what was happening inside the flagship Hermès boutique. I could see the transaction attempt flashing red on my laptop screen like a heartbeat monitor flatlining. My sister Jasmine was undoubtedly standing at the counter holding a $12,000 Birkin bag in ostrich leather. I knew that bag. She had been posting photos of it on her story for the last hour, calling it her birthday present to herself. In my mind, I could see the exact tilt of her chin as she handed the sales associate the heavy platinum credit card. It was my card, but it bore her name as an authorized user. She would have tossed it onto the glass counter with the casual arrogance of someone who has never earned a dollar in her life. She was probably already posing for a selfie with the orange box, waiting for the satisfying beep of approval. But the beep never came. Instead, there was the sharp, jarring buzz of a decline. I watched the second attempt flash on my screen. This time the alert code was different. Code 41, lost or stolen. I took a sip of wine and imagined the color draining from Jasmine's face. She would be laughing it off at first. She would tell the sales associate that the machine must be broken. She would demand they run it again. She would raise her voice because that is what Jasmine does when reality refuses to bend to her will. Then came the third alert. This one was from a different card. Hunter had stepped in. My brother-in-law, always desperate to play the hero, likely pulled out his own wallet with a flourish. "Put it on mine, babe," he would say loud enough for the other shoppers to hear. He wanted to look like the provider. He wanted to look like the wealthy entrepreneur he pretended to be. But Hunter's card was linked to the same frozen trust. The decline was instant, and this time the consequences were physical. In high-end Parisian boutiques, a declined card followed by a fraud alert does not just result in an awkward apology, it results in security. I pictured the moment the sales associate's polite smile vanished. She would have signaled the large man in the dark suit standing by the door. The air in the store would have shifted from welcoming luxury to hostile suspicion. Jasmine and Hunter were no longer valued American tourists. They were now potential credit card thieves trying to fence stolen goods. I imagined the manager stepping forward, his voice low and icy, asking them to provide alternate payment or leave the premises immediately. I imagined Jasmine trying to argue, her hands shaking as she realized she did not have 10 euros in cash, let alone 12,000. They had to walk out of those glass doors empty-handed. The orange box remained on the counter. The other customers stared. The security guard watched them all the way to the street. They were stranded in one of the most expensive cities in the world, and I had just cut the strings. The puppet show was over. 3 hours later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the marble surface of the coffee table. The glowing screen cut through the darkness of the room, flashing the words Mama Louise in bold, aggressive letters. It was 3:14 in the morning in Chicago. In Paris, it was mid-morning, right about the time the authorities would be processing the report of credit card fraud I had filed. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I sat still on the beige sofa, my legs tucked underneath me, watching the device dance across the stone coaster. It looked like an angry little animal demanding attention. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. It was a vintage I had been saving for a special occasion, and tonight certainly qualified. The vibration stopped for a split second and then started again instantly. She was not going to stop. I leaned forward and tapped the green answer button, followed immediately by the speaker icon. I did not say hello. I did not ask what was wrong. I simply placed the phone back on the table and leaned back into the cushions. Nia, pick up this phone right now. My mother's voice tore through the silence of the penthouse. It was shrill and laced with a panic I had never heard before. Usually, her voice was controlled and condescending, but tonight it was unhinged. What did you do? Jasmine is at the police station. They are treating her like a common criminal. They said the cards were reported stolen. Hunter is in handcuffs, Nia. Handcuffs. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the crimson liquid coat the sides. In the background of the call, I could hear chaotic noises. There were sirens. There was a man shouting in French. And underneath it all, I could hear the unmistakable sound of my sister Jasmine sobbing. It was the same cry she used when she wanted a new car, or when she wanted me to do her homework. It was a weaponized sound, but from 4,000 miles away, it had no power. You have to call the bank immediately. My mother screamed again, her voice cracking. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave her permission. She has nowhere to go. The hotel evicted them. They seized their luggage. How could you be so cruel? She is your baby sister. She is all alone in a foreign country. Fix this, Nia. Fix this right now, or so help me God. My baby sister was 30 years old. My baby sister had stolen $25,000 from me to drink champagne while I worked 80-hour weeks. But I did not say that. I did not interrupt the stream of abuse pouring from the speaker. I practiced what psychologists call the gray rock method. I became uninteresting. I became unresponsive. I became a stone that the narcissist breaks their toes kicking. The threats used to make me cry. They used to send me spiraling into panic attacks, desperate to fix whatever imaginary slight I had committed. Now they sounded like distant traffic. Meaningless noise. If you do not fix this, do not you dare call yourself my daughter again. You are dead to us. Do you hear me? Dead. I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call mid-scream. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy and luxurious. It felt like a warm blanket. I took another long sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Dead to you, I whispered to the empty room, finally. I did not block the number. I wanted to see the voicemails pile up. I wanted a record of their unraveling for the files. I finished my glass, rinsed it in the sink, and walked to my bedroom. For the first time in 35 years, I was going to sleep peacefully on my birthday. To understand why my mother is currently screaming into her voicemail, you have to understand the dynamic that has ruled our house since the day my sister was born. It was never just about money. It was about worth. In the African American community, there is sometimes a painful, unspoken hierarchy based on shade and texture, and in the Jones household, that hierarchy was law. Jasmine was born with skin the color of caramel and loose bouncing curls that strangers stopped to admire in the grocery store. I was born with skin rich and dark like obsidian and hair that defied gravity in tight coils. In a healthy home, this difference would be beautiful. In my home, it was a destiny. My mother used to brush Jasmine hair for hours, cooing over how silky it was, while she handed me a wide-tooth comb and told me to go deal with my situation in the bathroom. Jasmine was the show pony. I was the workhorse. I remember my 12th birthday party, which was actually just a barbecue for the church deacons. I spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen seasoning chicken and slicing potato salad while Jasmine, who was only 7, sat in the living room reciting poems for the guests. When I tried to come out to grab a plate, my father blocked the doorway. He looked down at me not with love but with utility. He said, "Nia, look at your sister. She is delicate. She is a flower that needs light. God gave Jasmine the light to shine, but he gave you the broad back to carry her. Your sister is a star, Nia, and stars need a dark sky to be seen. You are the sky. Do not ever try to eclipse her. Your job is to make sure she has everything she needs to sparkle. That sentence became the constitution of my life. When I brought home straight A's and a scholarship letter to a prestigious math camp, my mother sighed and said, "That is nice, dear, but who is going to help Jasmine with her remedial reading if you go away for the summer?" I stayed home. I tutored her. I did her homework. I ironed her dresses for pageants I was not allowed to enter. I learned that my intelligence was only valuable if it could be harvested to fix Jasmine mistakes. They created a monster. By shielding Jasmine from every consequence and every hardship, they ensured she never developed a single survival skill. They treated her incompetence as adorable, and my competence as mandatory. They thought they were building a dynasty with a queen and a servant. But they forgot that the servant is the one who holds the keys to the castle. They spent decades telling me I was born to serve. They never suspected that one day the servant would realize she owned the master's house. I am not the dark sky anymore. I am the storm that is about to wash away their entire artificial world. Then there is Hunter. If Jasmine is the show pony, Hunter is the ringmaster of a circus that does not exist. He describes himself on LinkedIn as a serial entrepreneur and a disruption architect. In reality, he is a 32-year-old man whose last 3 startups failed before they even launched a website. He speaks exclusively in buzzwords about crypto and blockchain and the hustle mindset, yet he has not paid a utility bill with his own money since he married my sister 4 years ago. He is the kind of man who believes he is the patriarch of the family simply because he is male. He walks with an unearned confidence that takes up all the air in the room. I remember last Thanksgiving vividly. I had paid for the catering, I had paid for the wine, I had even paid for the floral centerpiece on the table. Yet Hunter sat at the head of the table carving the turkey like a king holding court. He looked at me over his glass of Pinot Noir, which I had bought, and asked me how work was going. "Still doing the boring bean-counting stuff, Nia?" he asked with a smirk that made me want to scream. "I do not know how you do it, staring at spreadsheets all day, checking receipts. It is so small. You need to think big, Nia. You need to understand how real wealth is created." That is what I tell Jasmine. We are building an empire here. We are moving assets into the metaverse. That is the future, not your dusty old tax audits. My mother nodded enthusiastically, as if he had just announced a cure for cancer. "Listen to Hunter, honey," she told me. "He has a vision. You could learn something from him about ambition." I sliced my turkey in silence, letting the knife scrape against the china. The empire he was building was funded entirely by the allowance I deposited into the family trust every month. His designer suits were bought with my bonuses. His leased BMW was paid for by the overtime hours I worked auditing corporate fraud. He was lecturing the bank on economics while standing inside the vault he was robbing. He called my job boring because he did not understand it. He did not know that while he was playing make-believe with digital coins, I was tracking real money for the most dangerous people on Earth. He loved to play the provider. He loved to pull out his credit card at dinner and insist on paying, knowing full well the bill would eventually be covered by me. It was a performance, a masquerade of masculinity funded by the sister-in-law he despised. But tonight the performance ends. Tonight, Hunter is going to learn a very hard lesson about macroeconomics. You cannot be a disruption architect when your credit score is 0 and the woman you mocked just closed the bank. I wonder how big his vision will be when he's trying to explain to the French police why he is trying to buy luxury goods with a dead card. I wonder if he will tell them about the hustle mindset while they are processing his deportation papers. The alpha male is about to become a liability. 2 days. That is exactly how long a 5-star establishment like the Ritz Paris will tolerate a payment discrepancy before the veneer of luxury evaporates. I imagine Jasmine thought her charm would buy her time. She thought she could bat her eyelashes at the concierge and promised that it was just a banking glitch that would be sorted out by Monday. She forgot that hotels run on ledgers, not smiles. When the pre-authorization hold for the 3rd night failed, the system flagged them not as guests, but as squatters. The eviction was not loud. High-end places do not make scenes, they simply remove them. I can picture the shift manager, a man with impeccable posture and a heart made of ice, approaching them in the lobby. He would not have shouted. He would have leaned in close and whispered that their key cards had been deactivated and that if payment was not rendered immediately, security would be forced to escort them off the premises. Jasmine likely tried to throw a tantrum. She likely pulled the "do you know who my family is" card. But in Paris, nobody cares about the Jones family from Chicago. They were escorted to the curb. There was no bellman rushing to load their bags into a waiting limousine. There was just the heavy thud of 4 oversized suitcases hitting the wet pavement of the Place Vendôme. It was raining in Paris, a cold gray drizzle that seeps into your bones. Jasmine was wearing strappy heels and a light trench coat meant for Instagram photos, not for hauling luggage through a storm. The image is almost poetic. My sister, the self-proclaimed princess, standing on a street corner shivering, while her husband tapped furiously on a phone that no longer had data service. They had to walk. They could not call an Uber because their apps were linked to the dead cards. They could not hail a taxi because they had spent their cash on croissants and tips. So they walked. I want you to visualize this. The golden child dragging a 50-pound suitcase over uneven cobblestones. The wheels clattering loudly, echoing off the historic buildings. Her hair, the expensive blowout she had bragged about, was plastered to her skull. Her mascara was likely running down her cheeks in dark streaks, making her look like a tragic clown. Hunter walked 5 paces ahead of her, not helping, just muttering curses under his breath. He was probably blaming her. He was asking why her sister was such a bitch. He was asking why she didn't bring backup cash. They were the picture of misery. A reverse Cinderella story where the carriage turns into a pumpkin and the princess is left in the mud. For the first time in her life, Jasmine was experiencing the physical discomfort of poverty. The wet socks, the aching feet, the uncertainty of where she would sleep that night. She was walking past cafes filled with warm, happy people, realizing that she was on the outside looking in. She had spent her whole life looking down on people who struggled. Now she was one of them. And the longest walk of her life was just beginning. My phone lit up again just as the sun was beginning to crest over Lake Michigan. It was a text message from Jasmine. It was a long, rambling block of text devoid of punctuation, which was usually her signature style when she wanted to convey extreme distress. She claimed that she and Hunter had been walking near the Louvre, trying to find a consulate, when 3 men with knives jumped them in an alleyway. She wrote that they had been thrown to the ground and stripped of everything, including their cash and her wedding ring. She said they were bleeding. She said they were traumatized. She ended the message with a plea that would have melted a stone. She begged me to wire $5,000 immediately, not for a hotel, but for medical bills and emergency passports. She said, "Please, Nia, we could have died. Do not let us die here." For a brief second, my heart actually stuttered. It is a biological reflex to panic when you hear your sibling is in danger. But then the forensic accountant in me took over. I took a deep breath and looked at the facts. Jasmine said they were near the Louvre. That is the first arrondissement. It is one of the most heavily policed square miles on the planet. I walked over to my laptop and opened a new window. I did not open a banking app. I opened the public safety dashboard for the Paris Prefecture of Police, which tracks reported crimes in real time. I also pulled up the live feed from a traffic camera near the location she described. I scanned the logs for the last 2 hours. There were no reports of armed robbery. There were no reports of an assault. There were no ambulances dispatched to that sector. In fact, the only police activity recorded in that district was a citation for an illegally parked delivery truck. I zoomed in on the traffic camera feed. The streets were quiet. The tourists were walking calmly. There was no crime scene tape. There was no blood. My sister was not bleeding in an alley. She was likely huddled in the lobby of a hostel or a cafe inventing a violent crime because she knew violence was the only thing that might override my anger. She was using a fake trauma to unlock my wallet. It was a strategy she had used before. Like the time she claimed she needed money for a car repair because she had been hit by a drunk driver, when in reality she had just spent her rent money on shoes. I took a screenshot of the police incident map, which showed a sea of green indicators meaning all clear. I circled the timestamp. Then I took a screenshot of the weather report, which showed it was currently pouring rain in the first arrondissement, yet in her text she mentioned the dusty ground. I composed my reply. I did not offer sympathy. I wrote simply, "That is very strange, Jasmine, because I am looking at the live police database for that district, and there have been 0 violent crimes reported in the last 24 hours. I also see that there are CCTV cameras on every corner of that block. I am going to call my contact at the U.S. Embassy and have them pull the security footage to help catch these attackers. Should I tell them to look for the couple faking a robbery, or should I tell them to look for the invisible men?" I hit send. The 3 dots indicating she was typing appeared almost instantly. They danced on the screen for a long time, then they disappeared. She did not reply. She knew I had caught her. She realized that she was not dealing with her big sister anymore. She was dealing with an investigator who treated lies like mathematical errors. They always get corrected. The silence that followed was her confession. She was safe. She was just desperate, and now she was out of options. My father loved 2 things in this world more than life itself. The first was his image as a patriarch, and the second was his vintage 1978 Cadillac Eldorado. It was maroon with white leather interior, and he spent every Sunday morning polishing the chrome until it gleamed like a mirror. That car was not just a vehicle, it was his pride. It was the symbol that he had made it out of the neighborhood and into the middle class. He had told me once that he would be buried in that car. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and a frozen bank account changes a man's priorities. With Jasmine stranded in Paris and me refusing to unlock the vault, my parents were forced to cannibalize their own assets. I received a notification from the Department of Motor Vehicles because I handle all their administrative paperwork. The title for the Cadillac had been transferred. I can only imagine the scene. My proud father standing in the lot of a predatory "we buy cars for cash" dealership, negotiating with a man who smelled like cheap cigars. He would have been sweating. He would have been humiliated. The car was worth $20,000 to the right collector, but he did not have time to find a collector. He needed cash today. He likely took $4,000 or $5,000 for it. He sold his legacy for pennies on the dollar just to bail out his golden child. An hour later, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it go to voicemail and then listened to the recording. His voice was shaking, not with sadness, but with a rage so pure it felt like heat radiating from the speaker. "You are the most ungrateful child God ever put on this earth, Nia." He spat the words out. "I just sold my car. Do you hear me? I sold the Eldorado. My baby. I sold it to strangers because your sister is starving in a foreign country and you are playing games. You forced me to do this. You took away my joy to punish her. I hope you are happy. You are a cold, heartless woman, and I am ashamed that you carry my last name." I sat in my office chair and replayed the message. He sold his car. He sacrificed his most prized possession to buy 2 one-way tickets from Charles de Gaulle to O'Hare. He did not sell the car to pay for my college tuition years ago. He did not sell it when I needed braces, but for Jasmine he burned his idol without hesitation. I logged into the airline database to see what he had purchased. The money from the car was only enough for 2 seats in economy class, on a budget carrier with a layover in Iceland. Row 42, the very back of the plane right next to the lavatories. I looked at the seating chart and allowed myself a dry, humorless laugh. Jasmine, who had flown there sipping champagne in a lie-flat pod, was coming home with her knees pressed against a plastic tray table, smelling blue toilet water for 9 hours. My father called me heartless. I prefer to think of myself as a teacher. And today, his lesson was about the true value of $1 when you actually have to earn it yourself. The Cadillac was gone. The bridge was burned. And they were finally coming home to face the music. The flight from Paris to Chicago is 9 hours long. In a lie-flat pod with noise-canceling headphones and a warm duvet, 9 hours feels like a nap. In the last row of a budget carrier, 9 hours feels like a prison sentence. My father's beloved Cadillac had only generated enough cash for 2 seats in row 42. On this particular aircraft, row 42 does not recline. It is bolted upright against the rear bulkhead directly adjacent to the lavatories. I tracked their flight online, watching the little plane icon crawl across the Atlantic, and allowed myself to visualize the scene inside the cabin. Jasmine, who had arrived in France wearing oversized sunglasses and looking like a celebrity, was now squeezed into the middle seat of the center aisle. To her left was likely a stranger who did not care about her family pedigree. To her right was Hunter, a man who undoubtedly practiced aggressive manspreading, taking up not only his space, but half of hers as well. Every time the lavatory door opened, a waft of blue chemical disinfectant and stale air would roll over them. Every time a passenger needed to use the facilities, they would bump against Jasmine's shoulder. There was no flight attendant rushing over to offer her a hot towel. There was only the harsh overhead lighting and the plastic tray table that hit her knees every time the person in front of her leaned back. I checked her Instagram feed one last time. Usually Jasmine documents every moment of her existence. She posts the clouds, she posts her passport, she posts the in-flight meal with a caption about how blessed she is. Today her story remained completely blank. There were no updates, there were no selfies. I imagined her pulling her phone out of her purse, aiming the camera, and seeing the reality on the screen. She saw the gray plastic seat back. She saw the cramping legroom. She saw the lack of luxury. For the first time, she realized that without my funding, she was not an influencer. She was just passenger 42B. She could not curate this reality. She could not put a filter on the smell of the bathroom or the crying baby 3 rows ahead. She slid her phone back into her pocket and sat in the darkness of her own irrelevance. The golden child was tarnishing in real time. Hunter, I assumed, was making it worse. He was likely complaining about the legroom, blaming the airline, blaming the French, and blaming her. He was the kind of man who became petulant when uncomfortable. He would be sighing loudly, shifting constantly, and refusing to share the armrest. They were trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, stripped of their pretenses, forced to sit with nothing but their anger and each other. By the time those wheels touched the tarmac at O'Hare, they would not be a power couple returning from a romantic getaway. They would be 2 exhausted, bitter people looking for someone to blame, and I knew exactly who they were coming for. I poured myself a glass of water and went to the front door to double-check the locks. The storm was about to make landfall. The next morning, the sun rose over Chicago with a deceptive calm. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but inside my apartment, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. I knew they were coming. My father's flight tracking information showed they had landed at O'Hare 20 minutes ago. They would be tired, they would be hungry, and most importantly, they would be furious. I did not spend the morning cowering in bed. I spent it preparing the battlefield. I turned my living room into a courtroom. I moved the coffee table slightly to the left to create a clear line of sight from the entrance. I placed 3 distinct stacks of paper on the dining room table, each one bound with a heavy black clip. Stack 1 was the bank statements from the last 5 years, highlighting every single deposit I had made. Stack 2 was a forensic breakdown of Hunter's failed businesses and his outstanding debts. Stack 3 was the deed to the house my parents currently lived in, along with the tax lien documents I had purchased. Then came the surveillance. I walked over to the bookshelf and adjusted the spine of a vintage encyclopedia. Hidden between the pages was a high-definition camera with a wide-angle lens. I moved to the kitchen island and positioned a small motion-activated device behind the fruit bowl. Finally, I double-checked the main security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I pulled up the feed on my iPad. The angles were perfect. Every scream, every threat, and every confession would be recorded in 4K resolution. I went to the mirror and adjusted my blazer. I had chosen a sharp, tailored navy suit, the kind I wore when I was presenting evidence to a grand jury. I pulled my hair back into a tight bun. No loose strands, no softness. I looked at my reflection and saw a stranger. The pleading daughter who just wanted to be loved was gone. Staring back at me was a prosecutor ready to deliver a closing argument. I poured myself a glass of iced water and sat in the high-backed armchair facing the door. I placed my phone face down on the table. The silence in the apartment was absolute. It was the deep, pressurized silence of a submarine before a torpedo impact. I checked my watch. 1 hour since landing. Traffic would be light. They were probably in the elevator right now rehearsing their lines. My mother would lead with tears. My father would lead with disappointment. Jasmine would lead with victimhood. And Hunter would try to use big words to intimidate me. I took a slow, steady breath. Let them come. Let them bring their anger and their entitlement. I had the receipts, I had the law, and for the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. The elevator dinged down the hall. Heavy footsteps approached my door, then the aggressive jiggle of a key in the lock, a key that no longer worked. I didn't move. I waited for the inevitable pounding to begin. The trial of the Jones family was about to commence. The first blow to the door sounded like a battering ram. It was not a knock. It was a demand. I could see the heavy oak frame vibrate with the force of my father's fist. I stood up from the armchair and smoothed the front of my blazer. I walked to the door with a slow, deliberate cadence counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I unlocked the deadbolt and turned the handle. I did not pull the door open. It was shoved inward with such violence that it slammed against the wall behind me, leaving a dent in the plaster. My mother was the first one through the breach. She did not look like the composed matriarch of the Jones family. Her hair was frizzy from the humidity. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild. She did not speak. She did not ask for an explanation. She simply lunged at me. Her right hand came up fast, aiming for my cheek. It was a movement I knew well. It was the same backhand that had disciplined me for 20 years. In the past, I would have flinched. I would have closed my eyes and taken the hit. But today, I was not that girl. My hand shot up and caught her wrist in midair. The sound of skin hitting skin was sharp and loud. My mother gasped. Her eyes went wide with shock. She tried to pull her arm back, but I held it firm. My grip was iron. I looked her dead in the eye and saw the realization dawn on her face. The power dynamic had shifted. "We do not do that anymore, Louise," I said, my voice low and steady. I released her arm with a small shove, and she stumbled back into my father, who was coming up behind her. Behind them, Jasmine pushed her way into the foyer. She looked like a tragedy. Her designer coat was stained. Her face was a mask of running mascara and snot. She did not look at me. She collapsed onto the floor right there in the entryway, burying her face in her hands. "You ruined everything," she wailed. Her voice was a high-pitched shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. "You left us there to die. You are a monster, Nia. A jealous, ugly monster." Hunter was the last to enter. He stepped over his weeping wife without even looking down. He walked into my apartment as if he were inspecting a property he intended to buy. He was wearing a wrinkled suit that smelled of stale airplane air and nervous sweat, but his arrogance was untouched. He looked around the penthouse, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the expensive art. He sneered. "So this is where all the money went," he said. He crossed his arms over his chest and stood with his legs apart, trying to maximize his physical presence. "You have been holding out on us, Nia, living like a queen while your family suffers. I hope you have a good lawyer, because what you did is criminal." I walked past him and sat back down in my armchair. I crossed my legs and picked up my glass of water. I looked at the chaotic scene before me. My mother panting with rage, my sister sobbing on the floor, my brother-in-law posturing like a peacock, my father standing in the doorway looking old and defeated. "Welcome home," I said. "Please shut the door. You are letting the draft in." My mother did not sit down. Pacing back and forth across my living room rug, she began the second act of her performance. The physical assault had failed, so she switched seamlessly to emotional warfare. She clutched her chest, her breathing becoming ragged and loud, designed specifically to make me worry about her heart. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her foundation, but she did not wipe them away. She wanted me to see the mess. She wanted me to see the damage I had allegedly caused. "You are evil," she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and self-pity. "Do you know what I went through to bring you into this world? I laid on a hospital bed for 18 hours screaming in agony. I felt my body rip apart to push you out. I bled for you. I sacrificed my youth, my body, and my dreams so you could breathe air. And this is how you repay me. By torturing the family that gave you life. She gestured wildly around the room, her hand knocking over a vase of white lilies on the side table. Water spilled onto the hardwood, but she ignored it. Look at this place, Nia. Look at how you live. You are sitting here in a fortress of glass and marble. You have expensive art on the walls and wine in the fridge that costs more than my monthly grocery bill. You are drowning in money. You are so rich you probably do not even know how much is in your bank account, and yet you begrudge your sister a few pennies. She pointed a shaking finger at Jasmine, who was still weeping theatrically on the floor. Your sister is delicate. She needs help. $25,000 is nothing to you. It is a drop in the ocean. It is pocket change. But you would rather watch her starve in a foreign country than share a tiny fraction of your hoard. You are selfish. You are a miser. I do not know where I went wrong. I gave you everything. I loved you. I fed you. And you grew up to be a cold-hearted snake who counts coins while her family suffers. I watched her with clinical detachment. In my line of work, we call this DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse, victim and offender. She was rewriting history in real time. She was converting her theft into my stinginess. She was turning her negligence into my cruelty. She spoke about childbirth not as a natural process, but as a transaction. A debt that I could never repay no matter how much money I handed over. She believed that because she gave me life, she owned my existence. She fell to her knees beside Jasmine, wrapping her arms around my sister and rocking her back and forth. It was a tableau of the grieving mother posing for an audience of one. I am sorry, Jasmine, she sobbed loudly. I am sorry I failed to protect you from your sister's wickedness. I thought I raised a human being, but I raised a monster. She has a stone where her heart should be. I took a sip of water. The glass was cool in my hand. I waited for her to finish the monologue. I knew she was waiting for me to crack. She expected me to apologize, to write a check, to beg for her forgiveness just to stop the noise, but I just checked my watch. The timestamp on the security recording was perfect. Every word she said, every admission that she felt entitled to my money was being logged. Are you finished? I asked calmly. Or do you have more to say about my birth canal debt? Because if you are done with the theatrics, we need to look at some numbers. And trust me, Mother, the math is not on your side. Hunter stepped between his weeping wife and me, like a shield made of cheap polyester. He held up a hand to silence my mother, who was mid-breath preparing for another round of wailing. He adjusted his cuffs and cleared his throat. This was his moment. He had been waiting for the women to stop talking so the man could solve the problem. He looked down at me with a smirk that was equal parts condescension and menace. He believed he was the smartest person in the room simply because he was the loudest. You are making a big mistake, Nia, he said, his voice dropping an octave to sound authoritative. You are acting on emotion. But the law does not care about your feelings. The law cares about facts. And the fact is, you have committed a felony. He began to pace in front of the coffee table, gesturing with his phone as if it were a gavel. I watched him with morbid fascination. It is always interesting to watch a man who barely passed high school civics try to lecture a forensic accountant on financial law. Technically speaking, he continued emphasizing the word technically as if it were a magic spell. That account was a shared asset. By giving your parents and Jasmine cards, you established what the courts call a constructive trust. You created an expectation of access. In the eyes of the state of Illinois, that money belongs to the community. By moving it without consent, you have committed civil embezzlement. You have misappropriated funds that were arguably joint property. He stopped pacing and leaned over me, placing his hands on the arms of my chair. He invaded my personal space so I could smell the stale airplane coffee on his breath. He thought he was being intimidating. He thought he was cornering me. I have friends, Nia. I have friends who are partners at major firms. I have friends in the state prosecutor's office. All I have to do is make one phone call. One call, and you are not just looking at a lawsuit. You are looking at losing your license. How are you going to pay for this penthouse when you are stripped of your CPA certification? How are you going to maintain this lifestyle when you are blacklisted from every firm in Chicago? He stood up straight and crossed his arms, waiting for me to crumble. He truly believed he had found the magic bullet. He thought my career was a house of cards that he could blow down with a few mispronounced legal terms. He did not know that I had memorized the banking statutes of this state before he had learned to tie his shoes. He did not know that an authorized user agreement specifically waives all rights to ownership. He was quoting legal dramas he had seen on television and presenting them as jurisprudence. I admit he put on a good show. For a moment, the room was silent. Jasmine stopped crying to look up at her hero. My mother looked at him with awe, thinking he had finally put me in my place. They were waiting for me to apologize. They were waiting for me to open the laptop and transfer the money back to avoid his wrath. Hunter tapped his foot impatiently. "Tick-tock, Nia," he said, checking his watch. "The banks close in an hour. I suggest you fix this before I have to ruin your life." I looked at him and felt a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. He had just threatened a professional auditor with a lawsuit based on imaginary laws. He had brought a plastic knife to a nuclear war. I did not flinch at his threats. I did not blink. I simply reached out and picked up the first heavy black binder from the stack I had prepared on the dining table. I waited in my hand for a moment, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I slid it across the marble surface. It spun perfectly and stopped inches from Hunter's hand. The sound of the heavy plastic hitting the stone was the only noise in the room. "Open it," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Hunter hesitated. He looked at the binder as if it were a bomb. Then, trying to maintain his bravado, he flipped open the cover. "What you are looking at is a forensic audit of the Jones Family Trust. For the last 60 months," I explained, standing up and walking slowly toward him. I broke down every single transaction. Column A shows deposits, column B shows withdrawals. I want you to look at column A, Hunter. Read the source of funds for every single line item." He stared at the pages. His eyes darted back and forth. January 2019, $10,000 from Nia Jones. February 2019, $8,000 from Nia Jones. March, April, May, page after page, year after year. Now I continued, my voice sharpening like a blade. "Show me the deposits from Louise and Joe Jones. Show me the contribution from the community you claim owns this money. Find me one single cent that I did not earn." Hunter flipped the pages faster now, desperate to find a counter-argument. But there was nothing. The column for my parents was a barren wasteland of zeros. "You said this was a partnership, Hunter. You said this was family property. But in a partnership, both sides contribute. This is not a partnership. This is a parasitism. For 5 years I have been the host, and you have been the ticks." I leaned in close, looking him dead in the eye. "In a court of law, ownership is determined by the source of funds. You cannot embezzle your own salary, you idiot. If you take this to a judge, he will not see a constructive trust. He will see an ungrateful family trying to legally rob their benefactor. So please call your friends at the prosecutor's office. Show them this binder. Tell them you want to sue the woman who paid for your wedding because she stopped paying for your vacation. They will not arrest me. They will laugh you out of the building." Hunter's face turned a shade of pale gray. He closed the binder slowly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that he had just threatened a shark in her own water. My father looked away, unable to meet my gaze. My mother opened her mouth to speak, likely to spin another lie, but I cut her off. "The bank is closed, Mother. And looking at these numbers, it should have been closed years ago." My father cleared his throat. It was a low, rumbling sound that instantly silenced the room. For the last 20 minutes he had stood by the door like a silent sentry, watching his wife scream and his son-in-law posture. Now he stepped into the center of the room. He moved slowly, his gait heavy with a performance of weary wisdom. He did not look at the binder of bank statements. He did not look at Hunter's pale face. He looked directly at me with eyes full of sorrowful judgment. "Nia," he said softly, shaking his head. "Put the papers away. We are not in a courtroom. We are in your home. Or at least I thought it was a home." He walked over to the window and looked out at the city, turning his back to me for a moment before pivoting to deliver his sermon. This was his tactic. While my mother used fire and Hunter used ice, my father used gravity. He used the weight of history and culture to crush me. I am disappointed in you, daughter. Deeply disappointed. He sighed, rubbing his hand over his bald head. I raised you to know better. I raised you to understand that out there in that world, they do not care about us. We have to look out for each other, because nobody else will. That is the Black way. That is our way. We climb together or we do not climb at all. He gestured to the luxury around us, sweeping his hand dismissively at my furniture. You have been out in this corporate world too long, Nia. You are starting to think like them. You are starting to act like the people who sign your paychecks. Cold, individualistic, selfish. You think because you have a fancy title and a view of the lake that you are an island. You think you made it here by yourself. He walked over to Jasmine, who was sniffing quietly, and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. Your sister stumbles, and instead of catching her, you kick her. You audit her. Is that what I taught you? Is that what your grandmother, God, rest her soul, would have wanted? She worked her fingers to the bone so we could have a legacy. And you are tearing that legacy apart over money. Money is just paper, Nia. Family is blood. He looked at me with a mix of pity and disdain, playing the ultimate card. The black tax. The unspoken rule that says if one of us succeeds, we all succeed. And if you try to keep your earnings, you are a traitor to your race and your kin. You are treating your family like a business transaction. That is a white man is game, Nia. And it breaks my heart to see you playing it so well. You are forgetting who you are. You are forgetting that without this family, you are nothing. So I want you to stop this nonsense. I want you to apologize to your brother-in-law for embarrassing him. I want you to transfer the funds back. And I want you to remember that you are a Jones before you are an accountant. Do the right thing, not for the law, but for your soul. The room was silent. My mother nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes, feeling vindicated. Jasmine looked up with hope. Hunter smirked, thinking the patriarch had finally put the unruly woman back in her place. They thought he had shamed me. They thought he had cracked the code. But as I looked at my father, I did not feel shame. I felt clarity. He was not asking for unity. He was asking for submission, and that price was too high. I turned away from my father and walked back to the table. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with judgment. It was heavy with confusion. My father's sermon about family unity hung in the air unanswered. I did not need to answer it with words. I needed to answer it with the second binder. I picked up the red folder. It was thinner than the bank statements, but far more lethal. I held it up so Hunter could see the label on the spine. It read simply, DOJ, Inquiry. Case 4920. You talked about the Black way, Dad. I said, my voice dangerously calm. You talked about how we need to protect each other from a world that wants to crush us. I agree. But what do you do when the person crushing you is sitting at your dinner table? I dropped the folder in front of Hunter. He did not reach for it. He stared at it as if it were radioactive. His hands, which had been crossed so arrogantly a moment ago, were now trembling slightly at his sides. Open it, Hunter, I commanded. Or should I summarize it for the class? He did not move, so I flipped the cover open. The first page was a mugshot. Not a recent one, but a booking photo from 3 years ago for check fraud. My mother gasped. Jasmine let out a small, strangled sound. Hunter did not just fail at business, I said, looking directly at my sister. He failed at being a citizen. That tech empire he talks about is a classic Ponzi scheme. He takes money from new investors, mostly people from our church, Dad, and uses it to pay off the interest on loans he took out under false identities. That is a lie, Hunter shouted, but his voice cracked. It is venture capital. You do not understand how seed funding works. I understand exactly how it works. I cut him off. And so does the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That binder contains a subpoena that landed on my desk 3 days ago. Because I am a forensic accountant, the FBI reached out to me to help trace the assets of a shell company called Vanguard Tech. Imagine my surprise when I realized the CEO was my brother-in-law. I walked over to Jasmine. She looked pale, her eyes darting between me and her husband. He is broke, Jasmine. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 2 years ago before you even got married. He has zero assets. The car is leased in his cousin's name. The watch on his wrist is a replica. And the money he used to take you to Paris was not his share of the family wealth. That was him desperately trying to spend my money before the feds froze his accounts. The room spun. My father slumped onto the sofa, looking suddenly frail. The patriarch who had just lectured me on legacy was now realizing he had welcomed a wolf into the sheepfold. Hunter looked like a trapped animal, sweat beading on his forehead. The arrogance was gone. The investor persona was gone. All that was left was a con artist who had just run out of road. "So, Dad," I said, turning back to my father, "do you still want me to apologize? Or do you want to thank me for not handing him over to the agents who are currently parked down the street?" The silence that followed my revelation should have been broken by a slap. I expected Jasmine to turn around and strike her husband. I expected her to scream at him for lying, for humiliating her, and for dragging her into a federal investigation. I watched her hands closely. They were shaking violently as she held the mugshot of the man she had married. She looked at the booking number. She looked at the charge sheet. The evidence was irrefutable. But Jasmine does not live in reality. She lives in a narrative where she is the protagonist, and everyone else is a supporting character designed to serve or obstruct her. If she accepted that Hunter was a fraud, she would have to accept that she was a fool. She would have to accept that her fairy tale wedding was a scam. Her ego could not survive that impact. So her brain did a backflip. It rejected the facts and found a new enemy. She crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it at my face. It bounced harmlessly off my shoulder, but the hatred in her eyes was lethal. "You are a liar," she screamed. Her voice was raw, shredding her throat. "You printed this. You made this up on your computer because you are jealous." That is what this is all about. It is not about money. It is not about the trust fund. It is about you being a bitter, lonely old woman. She stepped over the coffee table, ignoring her husband, who was cowering on the sofa, and got right in my face. I could smell her desperation. "Look at you, Nia. You are 35 years old. You have a penthouse and a closet full of suits, but who wakes up next to you? Nobody. You come home to a cold apartment and a bottle of wine. You see me and Hunter. You see how much he loves me. You see how happy we are, and it eats you alive. You cannot stand it." She grabbed Hunter's hand and yanked him up to stand beside her. He looked terrified, but she clung to him like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. "My husband is a visionary," she declared, her eyes wide and manic. "He is going to change the world. And you are just a glorified calculator. You want to destroy our marriage because you know you will never have what we have. You will never have a man look at you the way Hunter looks at me. You are unlovable, Nia. You are cold and hard, and that is why you are alone." I looked at Hunter. He was looking at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. He knew the truth. He knew the feds were real. But he was more than happy to let his wife use me as a human shield. "You are trying to sabotage us." Jasmine spat, tears streaming down her face again. "You want me to be miserable like you. But it is not going to work. We are a team. We are going to walk out of here, and we are going to build our empire without your dirty money. And when we are billionaires, do not you dare come crawling back. You are just a jealous spinster, Nia. That is all you will ever be." I watched her, panting, her chest heaving with the effort of her delusion. It was tragic. She was standing next to a man who had already spent her inheritance and was likely going to prison, and she was pitying me. She was holding onto a sinking ship and mocking me for standing on dry land. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt a profound, icy pity. She was not just the golden child. She was the sacrificial lamb, and she was sharpening the knife herself. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the destruction of a worldview. It is the sound of oxygen leaving the room. Jasmine's insults hung in the air, vibrating with a desperate, frantic energy, but they did not land. She had called me unlovable. She had called me a spinster. She had tried to weaponize my independence against me because her own dependence was currently dragging her down into the abyss. She was drowning, and she was furious that I was standing on the shore refusing to jump in and sink with her. I did not scream back. I did not list my accomplishments or defend my romantic life. Arguing with a delusion only validates it. Instead, I slowly rose from my armchair. I did not rush. I unfolded my limbs with the deliberate grace of a predator who has finished playing with its food. The afternoon sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting a brilliant, blinding backlight. By standing up, I became a silhouette. My shadow stretched long and dark across the Persian rug, engulfing the three of them where they sat. I looked down at them. My father slumped and defeated. My mother eyes wide with the shock of losing control. Jasmine panting and red-faced. And Hunter the cornered rat. From this angle they looked incredibly small. They looked like children who had broken a vase and were waiting for the punishment. "I am done," I said. My voice was not loud, it was flat. It was the voice of a judge reading a sentence. "I have presented the evidence. I have shown you the reality of your situation. You have chosen to reject it in favor of insults and lies. That is your prerogative. But you will not do it in my living room." Hunter started to open his mouth, perhaps to threaten me with another imaginary lawsuit. "If you speak again, Hunter," I interrupted him, cutting the air with my hand, "I will forward that FBI file to the agent in charge of your case within the hour. Right now it is sitting on my desk as a professional courtesy. Do not make me convert it into a witness statement." He snapped his mouth shut. The color drained from his face completely. He grabbed Jasmine's arm, his grip tight and urgent. He knew the game was over. He knew the walls were closing in. "You have 5 minutes to vacate my property." I continued checking my watch. "If you are still here at 4:30, I am calling building security to have you removed as trespassers. And given the mood I am in, I will ask them to escort you out through the service elevator with the garbage." My father stood up slowly. His knees popped. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and confusion, as if he was trying to recognize the daughter he thought he raised. "Nia," he said, his voice shaking, "you are making a mistake. You are choosing money over your blood. You will regret this when you are old and alone." I walked to the door and unlocked it. I held it open, the cold hallway air rushing in to mix with the heated atmosphere of the penthouse. "I would rather be alone in a penthouse than crowded in a prison cell, Dad," I replied. "And make no mistake, that is where your son-in-law is heading. You can follow him there or you can walk out this door. The choice is yours." Hunter did not wait for my father's permission. He pulled Jasmine toward the exit. She was still sobbing, dragging her feet, looking back at me with eyes full of hate. My mother followed, clutching her purse to her chest as if I might try to steal it. My father was the last to leave. He paused at the threshold, looking at me one last time, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cry. I simply stared back, my face a mask of stone. He shook his head and stepped into the hallway. I looked at their backs as they retreated toward the elevator. The dynasty was crumbling. The illusion was shattered. "And don't forget to close the door," I said. I didn't wait for them to do it. I slammed it shut myself. The lock clicked into place. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I was alone. Finally, gloriously alone. The silence in my apartment the next morning was not empty. It was heavy with a profound, vibrating sense of peace. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel thin. I didn't have to worry about a crisis phone call. I didn't have to dread an overdraft notification. The cancer that had been eating away at my finances and my sanity had been surgically removed. I woke up without an alarm at 7. The sun was streaming across the lake, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. I walked into the kitchen and started my ritual. I ground the beans. I boiled the water. I watched the dark liquid bloom in the French press. It was a simple mechanical process, but today it felt like a celebration. I poured the coffee into a ceramic mug, the steam rising in a perfect spiral, and walked into the living room. I sat on the sofa in the exact spot where Hunter had tried to threaten me less than 24 hours ago. I picked up the remote and turned on the television. I didn't go to Netflix. I went straight to the local news channel. I didn't need a TV guide to know what was playing. The screen flickered to life. The breaking news banner was already scrolling across the bottom in urgent red letters. And there it was. The camera was not focused on a downtown skyscraper. It was focused on a modest single-story house in the suburbs, my parents' house. The lawn, usually manicured to perfection by my father, was trampled by a swarm of dark windbreakers. The letters FBI were emblazoned in yellow across the backs of the agents moving in and out of the front door. The anchor's voice was professional but grave. Federal agents executed a raid early this morning at a residence in Oak Park, arresting Hunter Davis, the self-proclaimed CEO of Vanguard Tech. Davis is charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a Ponzi scheme estimated at over $5 million. Authorities allege that Davis targeted elderly members of his local church, promising high returns on cryptocurrency investments that never existed. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot, bitter, and perfect. On the screen, the front door opened. Two agents emerged, flanked by a uniformed officer. Between them walked Hunter. He was not wearing his Italian loafers. He was barefoot. He was still wearing the wrinkled suit from the flight, but the jacket was falling off his shoulder. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back. His head was hung low, his chin touching his chest. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a fraud who had been caught. The camera zoomed in. In the background, framed in the doorway, was my mother. She was holding her chest, wailing. And there was Jasmine. My sister was screaming at the agents, pulling at their sleeves, acting as if she could fight the federal government with a tantrum. An officer had to gently but firmly push her back inside. She looked wild. She looked broken. The anchor continued. Davis was reportedly staying with his in-laws after being evicted from a luxury hotel in Paris earlier this week due to lack of funds. Sources say the investigation was accelerated after a tip-off regarding suspicious international transfer attempts. I set the mug down on the coaster. I did not smile. I did not cheer. Did not. Forensic accounting is not about revenge. It is about balancing the ledger. Hunter had created a deficit in the universe. He had stolen from the vulnerable to feed his ego. The universe simply corrected the error. I picked up my phone and saw a dozen missed calls from my father. I didn't clear the notifications. I simply swiped them away. The audit was complete. The file was closed, and my coffee was getting cold. 6 hours before the news anchor read the headline, the sun had not yet risen over Oak Park. The street was silent, wrapped in the gray mist of early dawn. The manicured lawns and identical driveways were asleep, unaware that the neighborhood aesthetic was about to be violently disrupted. My parents' house sat in the center of the block, dark and imposing. The driveway was empty because the Cadillac was gone, sold to pay for the tickets that brought the fugitives home. Inside, they were likely sleeping the deep, exhausted sleep of people who believe they have escaped the storm. They were wrong. The storm had simply taken a detour to get a warrant. At 6 o'clock sharp, the silence was shattered. There was no polite knock. There was no doorbell. There was only the thunderous wood-splintering crash of a battering ram hitting the front door. The sound echoed down the street like a gunshot. Before the birds could even take flight, the foyer was swarming with agents in body armor. The shout was uniform and deafening. FBI, federal agents, search warrant. Hands where we can see them. My father, a man who worried if his grass was half an inch too long because of what the neighbors might think, woke up to the sound of tactical boots stomping on his polished hardwood floors. He stumbled out of his bedroom in his bathrobe, confused and blinded by the tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom. He raised his hands, his face a mask of sheer terror, watching armed men invade the sanctuary he had spent 40 years building. My mother was behind him, clutching her nightgown, screaming for them to stop, screaming that there must be a mistake. But the agents did not stop. They flowed up the stairs like a black tide. They were not looking for my parents. They were looking for the guest room. They kicked the door open. Hunter was not the confident CEO of Vanguard Tech in that moment. He was a man in mismatched silk pajamas curled up under a quilt. He didn't fight. He didn't argue legal precedents. He squealed. It was a high, pathetic sound as they dragged him out of bed and slammed him against the wall to pat him down. The handcuffs clicked into place, biting into his wrists, sealing his fate. The walk from the front door to the waiting SUV was the longest distance Hunter would ever travel. They did not let him change. They marched him out into the cold morning air in his sleepwear barefoot on the wet concrete. And this is where the tragedy turned into a spectacle. The noise had woken the street. In 2024, people do not just watch tragedies, they broadcast them. Mrs. Higgins from across the street was already on her porch. She was not holding a cup of sugar. She was holding her iPhone recording in 4K resolution. The teenager next door was live streaming on TikTok. The notification lights of a dozen phones pierced the darkness. The Jones family, who prided themselves on being the envy of the block, was now the morning entertainment. Hunter was shoved into the back of the government vehicle, his head ducked in shame. Jasmine ran out onto the lawn barefoot and hysterical, trying to pull the door open, screaming that they were hurting him. An agent firmly blocked her path, and the cameras caught every second of it. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the faces of the neighbors. They weren't looking away in respect, they were zooming in. The digital footprint of their humiliation was being uploaded to the cloud before the engine even started. The neighborhood watch had just become the World Wide Web. The intercom buzz cut through the morning silence like a physical blow. It was not the polite chime of a delivery. It was the incessant rhythmic stabbing of the call button from the lobby. I did not need to check the camera to know who it was. I could feel their desperation radiating up 40 floors. I pressed the release button not out of mercy, but because I wanted to look them in the eye one last time. I wanted to see if the shame of the raid had broken the spell. 3 minutes later, my front door opened. My parents did not storm in this time. They stumbled. In the span of 24 hours, they had aged a decade. My father, usually so upright, was hunched over as if gravity had increased. My mother looked like a ghost, her eyes swollen shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. They did not look at the view. They did not look at the furniture. They looked at me, but they did not see a daughter. They saw an ATM. My mother reached me first. She grabbed my hands, her grip clammy and cold. "Nia, thank God. Thank God you are here. It is a nightmare, a total nightmare. They took him, Nia. They put him in a cage like an animal. You have to help us. You have to get him out." I pulled my hands away gently but firmly. I stepped back, creating a physical boundary. "What do you want?" I asked. My father stepped forward. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that was already soaked. "The judge set bail," he said, his voice raspy. "They are calling him a flight risk because of the Paris trip. They set it at $500,000 cash. We do not have it, Nia. The house is leveraged. The car is gone. We have nothing liquid." He looked at me with an expectation that made my stomach turn. He truly believed that the solution was simple. "We need you to wire the money to the clerk," he continued. "Today. Right now. If we do not pay by noon, they transfer him to the county jail. He cannot survive in there, Nia. He is soft. They will eat him alive. You have the money. We know you do. You made your point yesterday. You taught us a lesson. Okay. We learned. Now write the check and bring the family back together." I stared at them. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was the death of hope. Until this exact moment, a tiny foolish part of me had hoped that seeing the FBI raid their home would be the wake-up call. I hoped they would realize they had been conned. I hoped they would apologize for choosing a criminal over their own child. But they hadn't changed. They were still sleepwalking. They were asking me, the forensic accountant, to use my clean, hard-earned money to bail out a man who had stolen millions from the elderly. "You are asking me to fund a criminal defense for a Ponzi schemer," I said slowly. "You are asking me to take $500,000 of legal income and give it to the court so that a liar can sleep in a comfortable bed." My mother stamped her foot, a flash of her old anger returning. "He is family. You do not turn your back on family. What is wrong with you? Is money more important to you than your sister's happiness? Jasmine is at home sedated because she cannot function without him. Do it for her." That was the sentence that sealed the door. Do it for her. Even in the wreckage of their lives, even with the police tape still fluttering on their lawn, the only person who mattered was Jasmine. I looked at my father, waiting for him to correct her. He just nodded. "You are the strong one, Nia," he whispered. "You can afford it. I walked to the door and opened it wide. I am not the strong one, Dad. I am just the smart one. And the smart one knows that you do not throw good money after bad. I am not paying his bail. I am not paying for his lawyer. And I am certainly not paying for your denial. Hunter is exactly where he belongs. And if you keep enabling him, you will end up right there beside him. Get out. A laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. It was dry, sharp, and completely devoid of humor. It bounced off the marble walls of the penthouse, startling my parents. They looked at me as if I had cracked under the pressure, but I had never been more lucid. My father was talking about leveraging the house. He was talking about equity. He was talking about a financial safety net that had disintegrated years ago, eaten away by the same termites that had destroyed his character, Pride, and Jasmine. You think you have a house to mortgage? I asked, the smile lingering on my face like a scar. You think you can walk into a bank and ask for a loan against the property at 42 Maple Street? Dad, you have not looked at your mail in 3 years, have you? You just hand the scary envelopes to me and tell me to handle it. You assume that because you sleep there, you own it. I walked back to the dining table and picked up the third and final binder. It was blue. I walked over to my father and pressed it against his chest. He took it reflexively, his hands trembling under the weight. Open it, I commanded. Read the deed. He flipped the cover open. I watched his eyes scan the legal document. I watched the moment his brain processed the words, but refused to believe them. He shook his head violently. This says Phoenix Holdings, he stammered. Who is Phoenix Holdings? I bought that house in 1990. My name is on the title. Your name was on the title, I corrected him. Until you stopped paying your property taxes 4 years ago. Until you took out a second mortgage to pay for Jasmine's wedding and defaulted on that too. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 18 months ago. The county put a lien on the property for unpaid taxes. You were going to be evicted, Dad. You were days away from the sheriff putting your furniture on the curb. My mother gasped, clutching her throat. You never told us, she whispered. I didn't tell you because I fixed it. I said, my voice cold. I created a shell company. Phoenix Holdings. I bought the tax lien. I bought out the bank's note. I paid off your debts to save you from the humiliation of homelessness. I own the house, Dad. Every brick, every shingle, every blade of grass on that lawn you love so much belongs to me. I stepped closer, towering over them. You have been living there rent-free because I allowed it. I paid the heat. I paid the water. I paid the insurance. I let you play the big man in the big house while I footed the bill. I did it because I loved you. I did it because I wanted my parents to have dignity in their old age. I took the binder back from his limp hands and snapped it shut. But you do not have equity. You have a landlord, and right now your landlord is looking at tenants who just asked her to bail out a felon with her rent money. You have no collateral. You have no leverage. You are guests in my property, and let me tell you, you are on a month-to-month lease. So before you ask me for another dime, I suggest you remember who actually keeps the roof over your head. Because unlike the bank, I do not need a court order to change the locks. I just need a screwdriver. You are looking at me with the eyes of a man who has wandered into a maze without a map, but the mechanism of your destruction is actually quite simple. It is brutally simple. Let me give you a crash course on the Illinois Property Tax Code. This is basic civic knowledge that a homeowner of 30 years should possess, but you were too busy playing the benevolent patriarch to Jasmine to bother with the fine print of your citizenship. When you fail to pay your property taxes, the county does not come to your door and politely ask for the money. They do not send a debt collector to break your legs. They do something far more efficient. They monetize your negligence. They hold a public auction called a tax lien sale. 3 years ago, when you drained your liquidity to pay for the champagne fountain at Jasmine's wedding, you ignored 3 red notices from the county treasurer. You shoved them in a drawer and told yourself you would handle it later. But later never came. That is where Phoenix Holdings entered the picture. I logged into the county auction portal. I purchased the tax certificates for the years 2020, 2021, and 2022. Essentially, I paid your taxes for you, but the law is very specific about what happens next. After an investor buys your debt, the homeowner is given a grace period, known as the redemption period, usually lasting 2 to 3 years. It is a window of opportunity to pay back the debt, plus interest, to save the property. I sat and waited. I watched the calendar pages turn. I watched the redemption period for the 2020 taxes expire, then the 2021 taxes, then the 2022 taxes. You did not pay a single cent. You continued to drive your Cadillac around town. You continued to host barbecues. You continued to live like a king, all while sitting on a financial landmine. You were completely oblivious. According to the statutes, once the redemption period expires without payment, the lien holder has the right to petition the circuit court for a tax deed. I filed that petition 6 months ago. The judge reviewed the case. He saw a homeowner who had completely abandoned his financial responsibilities. He signed the order. The deed recorded in the names of Joe and Louise Jones was canceled. A new deed was issued to Phoenix Holdings. The process was entirely legal, transparent, and irreversible. You were not scammed, Dad. You were evicted by your own apathy. In the world of finance, ignorance is not a shield. It is a death sentence. I did not need to use any dirty tricks. I just applied the law as it is written. I saved you from having a predatory stranger buy that lien and kick you out into the snow last winter. I let you stay there because I have a conscience. But clearly, that kindness was a strategic error, because instead of gratitude, you are standing here demanding that I liquidate my assets to save a criminal. The reality is, you have no assets to liquidate. You are guests in my house. You are drinking my water and sleeping under my roof. And right now, your tenancy is hanging by a very thin thread. I suggest you lower your voice and adjust your attitude because, unlike the bank, I do not need a sheriff to evict you. I just need to say the word. I reached into the back pocket of the blue binder and retrieved a single crisp document. It was stapled at the top corner and bore the official seal of the Cook County Sheriff's Office. I held it out to my father. He didn't want to take it. He looked at the paper as if it were infected with a deadly virus. But denial does not stop legal proceedings. I placed the document gently on the table in front of him, right on top of the deed he no longer owned. This is a notice to quit. I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection. In plain English, it is a 30-day eviction notice. My mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She clutched the edge of the dining table for support, her knuckles turning white. "You cannot do this," she whispered. "This is our home. We have lived there for 32 years. All our memories are there. Where are we supposed to go?" "That is a logistical question you should have asked yourselves before you decided to liquidate my trust fund," I replied, crossing my arms. "You stole $185,000 from me. You drained the accounts I built for your future to fund a luxury vacation for your favorite child. In the financial world, that is called a bad debt. And wise investors do not carry bad debt. They liquidate assets to cover the loss." I walked over to the window, looking out at the city one last time before turning back to face the ruin of my family. I am putting the house on the market on the 1st of the month. I have already spoken to a realtor. Given the current market value in Oak Park, the sale should net exactly enough to reimburse me for the theft, cover the 3 years of back taxes I paid, and settle the legal fees for the eviction process. It is a perfect zero-sum calculation. I am not doing this to be cruel. I am doing this to be whole. You took my liquidity, so I am taking your equity. My father stared at the eviction notice, his eyes watering. He looked like a man watching his life burn down in slow motion. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We are your parents. You cannot put us on the street. We are old. Who will rent to us with no money and a foreclosure on our record?" "Maybe you can stay with Jasmine," I suggested, the sarcasm cutting through the air like a knife. "Oh wait. She is currently living in a house that is about to be seized by the FBI as a proceed of crime. It seems the Golden Child does not have a guest room for you anymore." I walked to the door and held it open again. This time there was no hesitation in my movement. "You have 30 days. That is 720 hours. I suggest you spend less time worrying about Hunter's bail money and more time looking for a cheap storage unit for your furniture. If you are not out by the deadline, the sheriff will remove your belongings to the curb. And Dad, do not try to take the chandeliers. They are fixtures. They belong to the house, and the house belongs to me. Goodbye. My mother has always been a woman of verticality. She stands tall. She looks down on people. She holds her chin high to ensure the world sees her best angle. In my 35 years of life, I have never seen her lower her center of gravity for anyone, not even God. She treats Sunday service like a social event, not a spiritual one. But the prospect of poverty has a way of bending the stiffest spines. As the reality of the 30-day deadline settled into her consciousness, the matriarch crumbled. It was not a graceful faint. It was a mechanical failure. Her legs simply stopped supporting the weight of her denial. She hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud. Her expensive handbag slid across the polished marble, spilling a lipstick and a roll of breath mints. And then she did the unthinkable. She crawled. She moved across the few feet of space between us on her hands and knees and wrapped her arms around my ankles. I felt the fabric of my tailored trousers strain under her desperate grip. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the top of her head, at the gray roots she usually hid with expensive salon appointments she could no longer afford. Nia, she choked out, tilting her head back to look up at me. Her face was a ruin of running mascara and terror. You cannot do this. I am your mother. I am 60 years old. I cannot live in a storage unit. I cannot go to a shelter. Look at me. Look at what you are doing to me. She was weeping, but I listened closely to the frequency of her cries. I analyzed the data in her voice. There was no contrition there. There was no acknowledgement of the theft. There was no, I am sorry I hurt you. There was only the primal, selfish fear of a creature losing its habitat. She was not kneeling because she respected me. She was not kneeling because she loved me. She was kneeling because she had done the math and realized I was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. I will do anything, she babbled, clutching tighter, her fingernails digging into my leg. I will cook for you. I will clean this apartment. I will tell Jasmine she is wrong. I will never speak to Hunter again. Just let us stay. Please, Nia, do not humiliate us like this. What will the church say? What will my friends say if they find out I am homeless? That was the core of it. Even on her knees begging for her survival, she was worried about the gossip circle. She was worried about the optics. She was bargaining with her dignity to save her social standing. It was a grotesque display of narcissism masquerading as desperation. She was willing to become my servant not to repair our relationship, but to maintain the illusion of her life. I did not pull away immediately. I let her stay there for a moment, absorbing the image. The woman who had slapped me yesterday, who had called me unlovable, who had demanded I fund her golden child's criminal defense, was now reducing herself to a pathetic heap in my foyer. It was the total collapse of the power dynamic. The Empress had no clothes, no castle, and no subjects left to command. Get up, Louise, I said, my voice cold and distant. You are wrinkling my suit, and you are embarrassing yourself. You are not willing to change. You are just willing to beg. And I am not in the business of accepting charity cases, especially not from people who bite the hand that feeds them. Save your energy for packing. You are going to need it. I reached down and peeled my mother's fingers from my pant leg one by one. It required force. Her grip was hysterical, the desperate clutch of a drowning woman trying to pull a lifeguard under with her. But I did not flinch. I did not soften. Once I was free, I did not offer her a hand to help her stand. I stepped over her. I literally stepped over the woman who gave birth to me as if she were a discarded coat left on the floor. It was a cold movement devoid of malice but stripped of all sentimentality. I needed to physically traverse the obstacles she represented to get to my future. I walked across the expansive living room, the sharp click of my heels on the hardwood, echoing like a metronome counting down the final seconds of our relationship. I did not look back. I walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago skyline. The city was alive below me. The cars were moving in steady streams of red and white light. The lake was a vast breathing entity of blue. The world was huge, infinite, and full of possibility, and the drama occurring behind me suddenly felt microscopic. I spoke to the glass. I watched their reflection in the window pane, two small huddled figures in a room that was too big and too expensive for them to understand. "You are asking the wrong daughter for salvation," I said, my voice calm and conversational. "You spent 30 years betting on a different horse. You poured all your resources, all your adoration, and all your pride into Jasmine. You told everyone at church she was the special one. She was the beauty. She was the prize. You told me I was the worker bee, the sturdy one, the one who didn't need attention." I took a sip of my coffee, which was still warm. "So go to her. Go to your masterpiece. Ask Jasmine to take you in. Ask Jasmine to pay for your heart medication and your groceries. Ask her to buy you a new house to replace the one you lost." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. "Oh, that is right. You cannot. Because your masterpiece is currently unemployed. She has no skills. She has no degree because you told her she did not need one. She has no husband because he is currently being processed at a federal detention center. She cannot even feed herself, let alone carry the dead weight of two elderly parents. You backed a loser mother. You bet everything on a fantasy, and now that the fantasy has crashed, you want to cash out with the daughter you ignored. But the bank is closed." I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch my mother's eye in the reflection. She was still on the floor, staring at my back with a look of pure horror. "This is the end. Do not call me when you leave. Do not come to my office. Do not send me birthday cards. If you get sick, call 911. If you get hungry, call Jasmine. As of this moment, I am an orphan by choice. You have the daughter you always wanted, and that is exactly what you deserve. Now please remove yourselves from my property. I have work to do." The deadline arrived with the punctuality of a Swiss watch. There were no extensions. There were no last-minute reprieves. The sun beat down on Maple Street with an indifference that felt cruel. 30 days ago, my father had stood in my penthouse and lectured me about legacy. Today he was bent double under the weight of a cardboard box labeled kitchen, struggling to lift it into the back of a rented moving truck that had clearly seen better days. The scene was a masterclass in fallen grandeur. There were no professional movers. Movers cost money, and the Jones family was currently insolvent, so the patriarch had to do the heavy lifting himself. I watched from my car parked half a block away with tinted windows rolled up. My father looked smaller than I had ever seen him. His polo shirt was soaked with sweat, his bald head gleaming in the harsh light. He stumbled slightly as he walked up the metal ramp, his knees protesting against the labor. He wasn't moving into a new estate. He was moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood he used to make jokes about. My mother emerged from the front door carrying a lamp and a stack of framed photos. She was not wearing her Sunday best. She was wearing old leggings and a t-shirt I hadn't seen in a decade. She looked shell-shocked. She moved with a robotic sluggishness, placing items into the truck without any system or care. A vase that used to sit on the mantel, a symbol of her status, was tossed onto a pile of blankets. It didn't matter anymore. The stage was being dismantled and the props were just junk. And then there was Jasmine. If the neighbors were looking for a tragedy to gossip about, she was the headline act. The girl who had flown to Paris in couture was now standing on the curb in a stained gray tracksuit that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair, usually a glossy mane of extensions and blowouts, was pulled back into a messy, greasy bun. She wasn't carrying a box. She wasn't helping her elderly parents load the heavy furniture. She was simply standing there, clutching a plastic trash bag full of clothes to her chest, sobbing. It wasn't a pretty cry. It was an ugly, heaving sob of a child who has finally been told no. She looked at the house, my house, with a look of pure longing. She wasn't mourning the loss of the family home. She was mourning the loss of her backdrop. She was mourning the background for her selfies. She was realizing that without the trust fund, without the husband, and without the enabling parents, she was just a 30-year-old woman with no skills and nowhere to go. My father yelled at her to grab a box. For the first time in her life, He didn't use a gentle voice. He barked at her. Jasmine flinched, looking at him with betrayal, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was paralyzed by the reality of her new existence. The metal door of the truck slammed shut with a final hollow clang that echoed down the street. It sounded like a prison cell closing. My father climbed into the driver's seat, wiping his face with a rag. My mother got in the passenger side. Jasmine had to squeeze into the middle right over the gear shift, just like on the airplane. There was no luxury. There was no legroom. I watched the truck cough a cloud of black smoke before lurching away from the curb. They drove slowly, passing my car without knowing I was there. I watched them turn the corner and disappear from view. I looked back at the house. The lawn was green. The windows were dark. It was empty. It was quiet. It was finally completely mine. I put my car in gear and drove in the opposite direction. I didn't feel sad. I felt light. The audit was closed. The balance was zero. And I had a life to live. 6 months is a long time in the world of finance, but it is an eternity in the life of a socialite who has lost her audience. I had not spoken to my family since the day the moving truck rattled down Maple Street. I had not unblocked their numbers. I had not searched for their names. I assumed they were surviving, likely leeching off a distant cousin or maxing out credit cards in someone else's name. I did not expect to find the answer to whatever happened to Jasmine in the checkout lane of a big box retailer on a Tuesday evening. I was buying supplies for a charity drive my firm was sponsoring. My assistant was out sick, so I was pushing my own cart through the fluorescent-lit aisles of a Walmart on the outskirts of the city. I was standing in line checking emails on my phone when the rhythm of the beep 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 from the register next to me caught my attention. It was a sound of forced monotony. I looked up. The woman behind the register was wearing the standard issue blue vest. It was ill-fitting, hanging loosely off her shoulders. Her hair, once her crowning glory of expensive extensions and professional blowouts, was pulled back into a messy utilitarian bun held together by a cheap plastic clip. She was not wearing makeup. Her face looked pale and tired under the harsh overhead lights. She was scanning a 12-pack of generic soda for a customer who was arguing about a 50-cent coupon. It was Jasmine. I stood frozen for a moment, observing the specimen in this new habitat. The girl who had refused to fly economy, who had thrown a tantrum because her hotel room didn't have a view of the Eiffel Tower, was now standing on her feet for minimum wage, arguing about coupons. She looked older. The petulance around her mouth had deepened into bitter lines. Her fingernails, formerly long and manicured with intricate designs, were short and unpolished. She finished the transaction and handed the receipt to the customer. She sighed a heavy, exhausted sound and looked up to signal the next person in line. Her eyes swept across the queuing area and locked onto mine. Time seemed to suspend. I saw the recognition hit her like a physical slap. I saw her eyes widen. I saw her hand instinctively go to her hair, a phantom reflex from a life she no longer lived. She looked at my tailored wool coat. She looked at the expensive leather bag on my shoulder. Then she looked at her own blue vest. For a second, I thought she might scream. I thought she might launch into one of her famous tirades about how unfair the world was. But she did not. The fight had been ground out of her. Instead of confronting me, she did something far more telling. She looked down. She turned her body slightly away, shielding her name tag, as if that could hide her identity. She started grabbing items from her conveyor belt with frantic, clumsy speed, refusing to look up again. She pretended I was a ghost. She pretended she didn't exist. I did not step out of line. I did not go over to say hello. I did not offer her money. I simply watched her work. I watched the golden child bow her head to the reality of labor. The universe had finally balanced the ledger. She wanted a life of leisure without earning it, and now she was earning a living with no leisure. It was poetic. It was just. I paid for my items in silence. As I walked toward the automatic doors, I glanced back one last time. Jasmine was still looking down, scanning a bag of frozen peas trapped in the loop of her own consequences. I walked out into the cold night air, got into my car, and drove home. I slept better that night than I had in years. Federal courtrooms are designed to strip you of your humanity. They are cold, sterile boxes of wood and stone where dreams go to die. I was not there to see Hunter Davis receive his sentence, but the court transcripts paint a vivid picture. The man who once bragged about disrupting the tech industry stood before a federal judge in a suit that was 2 sizes too big, likely borrowed from a public defender's closet. There were no investors cheering for him. There was no Jasmine blowing him kisses. There was just the dry, monotone reading of the verdict. 8 years in a federal correctional facility. But Hunter was a narcissist to the bitter end, and a narcissist never accepts blame alone. If he was going down, he was going to ensure that everyone who ever benefited from his proximity went down with him. As the judge prepared to finalize the restitution order, Hunter's lawyer stood up. He announced that his client had cooperated fully with the investigation and wished to disclose the beneficiaries of the stolen funds to aid in asset recovery. Hunter pointed a shaking finger at the gallery. He did not point at the empty space where I should have been. He pointed directly at my parents, Joe and Louise Jones, who were huddled in the back row, clutching their Bibles, praying for a miracle. He told the court everything. He detailed the dinners. He listed the vacations. He provided receipts for the designer handbags he had gifted my mother and the golf clubs he had bought my father. He argued that while he may have solicited the funds, my parents were the ones who enjoyed the lifestyle. He claimed they pressured him to maintain the image of success, forcing him to take bigger and bigger risks. He painted them not as victims, but as accomplices who were happy to look the other way as long as the champagne kept flowing. The law is nuanced, but the IRS is not. While my parents were not criminally charged with fraud, they were hit with a reality that was perhaps even more painful. They were subject to a clawback suit. The government determined that the gifts and experiences they had enjoyed over the last 3 years were paid for with the proceeds of crime. Therefore, they were liable for restitution. My father, a man who had already lost his home and his car, was handed a civil penalty of $60,000. He stood up in the courtroom, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, stammering that he didn't know. He shouted that he was an innocent man. He shouted that Hunter was a liar. The bailiff had to tell him to sit down or be held in contempt. Hunter turned to look at them one last time before the marshals led him away. He didn't look remorseful. He didn't look sad. He looked satisfied. He had successfully shifted some of the weight of his failure onto the people who had worshipped him. The son-in-law they had chosen over their own daughter, the man they had praised as a visionary while belittling my hard work, had just delivered the final fatal blow to their financial existence. They left the courthouse not just broken, but destitute, carrying a debt they would never live long enough to repay. The wolf they invited to dinner had finally finished eating. The nameplate on the door changed today. It no longer reads Senior Associate. It reads Director of Forensic Services. The meeting with the managing partners was short, professional, and incredibly lucrative. They did not ask me about my family. They did not ask for a loan. They asked for my expertise, and they offered me a compensation package that made my previous salary look like an allowance. As I shook Mr. Henderson's hand, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. It was the final shedding of the imposter syndrome my family had instilled in me. They had spent years telling me I was the boring one, the worker bee who existed to serve the queen. Today, the worker bee bought the hive. I celebrated the promotion not with a loud party, but with a signature. I sat in a conference room at the title company the same way I had sat across from my father during his eviction, but this time the pen felt light in my hand. I was not signing a foreclosure document. I was signing the deed to a property that sits on the edge of the water, far away from the noise of the city and the wreckage of the Jones dynasty. The house is a masterpiece of limestone and glass, perched on a private stretch of coastline where the only sound is the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks. It is not a house designed to impress neighbors. The driveway is hidden, and the perimeter is secure. It is a house designed for peace. As I walked through the front door for the first time, as the owner, the silence was absolute. There were no arguments echoing in the hallway. There were no desperate pleas for money. There was only the sound of the wind and the vast open horizon. I poured a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, a bottle I bought simply because I liked the label, not because I needed to prove my wealth to anyone, and stepped out onto the terrace. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of violet and gold. I thought about Jasmine scanning items at Walmart under the harsh fluorescent glare. I thought about hunters sitting in a concrete cell staring at a steel toilet. I thought about my parents in their cramped apartment drowning in the debt of their own making. For years, I believed that revenge had to be loud. I thought it had to be a screaming match or a public shaming. I was wrong. Revenge is quiet. Revenge is standing on your own balcony, breathing air that belongs to you, knowing that your bank accounts are full and your conscience is clear. Revenge is the freedom to answer your phone or let it ring knowing that whoever is on the other end cannot take anything from you ever again. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like victory. The audit of my life was finally complete. The liabilities had been liquidated, the assets had been secured, and for the first time in 35 years, the bottom line was overwhelmingly positive. I turned my back on the darkening land and looked out at the water. The storm was over. The view was beautiful, and it was all mine. 36. That was the number on the cake sitting in the center of the reclaimed wood table on my terrace. In previous years, my birthday was always treated as a logistical inconvenience by the Jones administration. It was usually combined with Jasmine's half-birthday or forgotten entirely, until I reminded them at which point I would be allowed to pay for a dinner where my father would complain about the service, and my mother would criticize my outfit. The air would be thick with unspoken debts and conditional love. But tonight the air smelled of salt water and charcoal. I looked around the table at the people I had invited. There was Marcus, a senior analyst who had stayed late with me every night during tax season without asking for overtime. There was Sarah, my college roommate, who had let me sleep on her couch when I first moved to the city and was too proud to ask my parents for help. There was David, the architect, who designed this house and who had become a confidant during the construction process. There were no blood relatives present. There were no shared genetics. Yet for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly at home. The conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about politics, art, and bad dates. We laughed until our sides hurt about a mishap with the barbecue grill, but the most deafening sound of the evening was what was missing. There was no tension. There was no subtext. Nobody was scanning the room to see if there was someone more important to talk to. Nobody was waiting for a lull in the conversation to ask for a loan. Nobody looked at my new house with calculation, wondering how much equity they could extract from it. They were here simply because they liked me. They were here because they wanted to celebrate my existence, not my utility. Sarah stood up to make a toast. She raised a glass of cheap Prosecco because we didn't need the expensive stuff to have a good time, and looked at me with genuine warmth. To Nia, she said, smiling, "The smartest woman I know, and finally the happiest." I felt a lump form in my throat. It was a foreign sensation. I was used to steeling myself against criticism, not absorbing praise. I looked at their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the string lights. I realized that my father was wrong. He had told me that the world was cold, and that only family would protect you. He had it backward. The world is full of warm, decent people waiting to be found. It was my family that was the cold, isolated island. I stood up and blew out the candles. I didn't make a wish for the future. I didn't ask for more money or more success. I simply wished for this moment to freeze in time. I cut the first slice of cake and handed it to Marcus. He didn't ask me for a favor in return. He just said thank you. It is a strange and beautiful thing to realize that you can choose your tribe. I had spent 35 years trying to buy the love of people who were incapable of selling it. Now at 36, I was getting it for free. The ledger was closed. The bad debt was written off. And as I took a bite of the cake, I tasted nothing but sweetness. This was my new beginning. This was my real family. And we were just getting started. The laughter from the table behind me fades into a soft, ambient hum as I step toward the edge of the terrace. The wind off the lake is cool, but for the first time in my life, I do not feel a chill. I feel an impenetrable warmth that comes from within. I turn away from the dark horizon and look directly into the lens. I look at you because I know there are others out there. I know you are watching this and checking your bank account to see if you can afford to fix your mother's car again. I know you are reading text messages that start with guilt and end with a request for a transfer. I know you are tired. For 3 decades, I thought that saying no was an act of betrayal. I thought that my value as a human being was directly tied to my utility. I believed that if I stopped paying, I would stop being loved. My father called it loyalty. My mother called it duty. But I found the correct term in my accounting textbooks. It is called usury. It is an extraction of resources that leaves the host depleted and the parasite hungry for more. I treated my family like a charity case, but charities have mandates and audits. My family just had a bottomless pit of entitlement. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Biology is an accident of birth. It is not a suicide pact. Sharing DNA with someone does not give them the right to cannibalize your future. I spent years trying to build a foundation on quicksand, thinking that if I just poured enough concrete, if I just wrote a big enough check, the ground would stabilize. It never did. It just swallowed everything I threw into it. There is a proverb that I used to read and dismiss thinking it was too harsh. Now it is tattooed on my soul. Do not ever set yourself on fire to keep others warm. It sounds noble in poetry, but in practice, all it leaves you with is third-degree burns and a pile of ash. And here is the brutal truth that nobody tells you. If the people around you truly loved you, they would not ask you to burn. They would bring you a blanket. They would build a fire with you, not feed you to the flames. I look back at the table. Marcus is pouring wine for Sarah. David is laughing. These people have never asked me for a cent. They celebrate my victories and they respect my boundaries. They are the family I earned. I lift my glass. The liquid catches the light of the moon. So this is a toast to the black sheep, to the scapegoats, to the strong ones who are exhausted from carrying the weight of the world. Put it down. Walk away. Let them call you selfish. Let them call you cold. Let them spin their narratives while you spin your own success. Your life belongs to you. The audit is over. The debt is canceled. You are free. I take a slow sip. The taste is rich and complex. I offer a small, knowing smile to the camera as the view widens, pulling back to show not just me, but the sturdy, beautiful home I built on solid ground. The most profound lesson from Nia's journey is that financial abuse often disguises itself as family loyalty. We are conditioned to believe that supporting our blood relatives is an unconditional duty, even when it comes at the cost of our own stability and mental health. However, true love is reciprocal, not parasitic. Nia teaches us that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an act of necessary self-preservation. You cannot save people who are determined to drown, nor should you ever set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. Your worth is defined by your character, not your utility. Review your own life ledger today. If a relationship costs you your peace, it is too expensive. Close the account.